Sarah Mitchell's morning had begun like a chain of small, unrelenting disasters. The first domino fell when her alarm clock failed to go off at 6 a.m. as planned. Instead, she was jolted awake by her 12-year-old son, Tommy, vigorously shaking her shoulder at 6:45 a.m. His voice was a mix of urgency and boyish curiosity as he said, "Mom, the school just called. There's a water pipe burst and they're closing for the day." He was still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up in every direction. Sarah shot upright, her mind already racing to assess the morning's rapidly unraveling situation. As a single mother and the district's lead prosecutor, she had become adept at handling emergencies over the years. But today felt different, more precarious. She had 3 major cases to present in court, all in front of Judge Richard Harrison, the newly appointed judge whose strictness had already earned him a formidable reputation. Missing these cases or being unprepared was not an option. The mocking red digits of her bedside clock glared back at her, each second slipping away as she leapt into action. She rushed through her morning routine, her usual meticulousness suffering under the weight of time. Instead of her typical polished appearance, she hastily pulled on a navy blue pantsuit that, to her dismay, clearly needed ironing. Her hair, usually styled with precision, was smoothed back with hurried brushstrokes and an aggressive application of hairspray. As she fastened her shoes, she called her mother, her go-to support system for these parenting curveballs. "Mrs. Johnson can't take Tommy today," her mother informed her over the phone. "She's down with the flu." A deep sigh escaped Sarah's lips as she processed the news. Her mother, usually her fallback for childcare emergencies, was visiting Sarah's sister in Atlanta to help with her newborn. There was no time to dwell on alternatives. She turned to Tommy, who was now sitting cross-legged on the couch with a comic book. "Get dressed, buddy," she instructed, grabbing her briefcase. "You're coming to the courthouse with me today." Tommy's face lit up at the prospect. At 12, he found the courthouse thrilling, though Sarah made it clear that his excitement would be confined to sitting quietly in her office with a stack of books and his tablet. The rain began to pour as they stepped outside, turning the morning commute into a slog. The city streets were congested, water pooling in intersections and slowing traffic to a crawl. Sarah's fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel as the minutes ticked by. "Mom, you forgot to eat breakfast," Tommy pointed out, munching on a granola bar he had pulled from his emergency stash in the glove compartment. "I'll grab something later," Sarah replied, though they both knew it was unlikely. After 15 years as a district attorney, Sarah had grown accustomed to skipping meals when her workload demanded it. Finally, they arrived at the courthouse, but another setback awaited. Her reserved parking spot, something she had relied on without fail for the past 5 years, was blocked off with orange cones and a hastily written sign. Flooding had overtaken part of the lot, and maintenance crews were scrambling to fix the drainage. Sarah gritted her teeth, driving in circles until she found a spot in the public section, far from the courthouse entrance. She grabbed her umbrella, but a gust of wind immediately turned it inside out, rendering it useless. "Great," she muttered, tucking it under her arm as she shielded Tommy and her briefcase as best she could from the relentless downpour. By the time they reached the courthouse steps, her hair was damp, her makeup was smudged, and her suit was speckled with water. Joe, the courthouse security guard who had known Sarah for years, raised an eyebrow at her disheveled state as she passed through the metal detectors. "Rough morning, Ms. Mitchell?" he asked with a sympathetic smile. "You have no idea, Joe," she replied, attempting to fix her hair using the dull reflection of the scanner. "Don't worry about Tommy," Joe added, glancing at her son. "I'll keep an eye on him in your office." Sarah placed a quick kiss on Tommy's forehead and handed him his backpack. "Be good, okay? I'll check on you between cases." With a glance at her watch, Sarah's stomach dropped. It was already 8:35 a.m., 5 minutes past the start time for her first case. Being late was unheard of for Sarah Mitchell. Her reputation as a consummate professional, always punctual and impeccably prepared, was something she prided herself on. Hurrying down the marble hallway, her wet shoes squeaked with every step, adding to her growing anxiety. Outside the heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 3, she paused to smooth her damp hair and straighten her jacket. She drew a deep breath, steeling herself for the scrutiny she knew awaited her. Inside the courtroom, Judge Richard Harrison sat in his high-backed leather chair, meticulously reviewing the morning's case files. At 55, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, Judge Harrison had spent his career cultivating a reputation for discipline and order. Only 2 months into his position at the district courthouse, he was already known for his intolerance of tardiness and his insistence on running a tight ship. The courtroom buzzed with the usual pre-session murmurs, lawyers flipping through case notes, defendants whispering nervously to their attorneys, and clerks organizing files. When the heavy doors creaked open, the sound of wet shoes squeaking against the polished floor caused Judge Harrison to glance up, irritation flickering across his face. Through his reading glasses, he noticed a figure hurrying toward the front of the courtroom. From his elevated position, he could see a woman, her rain-dampened outfit and slightly disheveled appearance standing in stark contrast to the sharp-dressed attorneys he was accustomed to seeing. "You're late," he announced, his voice echoing through the quiet room. He didn't bother to look up from his papers as he spoke, his tone clipped and disapproving. "This court begins at 8:30 a.m. sharp, Ms. Mitchell," Sarah replied, standing tall despite her unkempt state. "Apologies, Your Honor. I had an unexpected morning." "Everyone has mornings, Ms. Mitchell," Judge Harrison interrupted, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were sharp, measuring her with the same scrutiny he applied to every detail in his courtroom. "This is not how we conduct ourselves in my court." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sarah felt the gazes of the courtroom settle on her. Her heart pounded, but she met the judge's stare with unwavering resolve. This day, which had begun in chaos, was far from over, and it was clear that both Sarah Mitchell and Judge Richard Harrison were about to leave lasting impressions on one another. The air in courtroom 3 had grown unusually heavy as the clock ticked forward. Judge Harrison sat rigidly at the bench, his gruff exterior betraying a flicker of unease after his hasty actions earlier that morning. Across the room, Sarah Mitchell stood with her back straight and head high, the very image of professionalism despite the water stains still clinging to her navy blue suit and her damp hair pulled neatly into a low ponytail. The scene that had unfolded moments ago lingered in everyone's minds, a moment that revealed more about the flawed nature of assumptions than about Sarah's tardiness. When the courtroom doors had first opened and Sarah had entered, late and rain-soaked, Judge Harrison hadn't looked past her appearance. His immediate judgment had been sharp and dismissive, cutting her off before she could explain and mistaking her for a defendant. It wasn't until she introduced herself, District Attorney Sarah Mitchell, that he truly looked up from his paperwork and realized the magnitude of his error. Now, as Sarah handled her cases with impeccable precision, the whispers and furtive glances from attorneys, clerks, and even the court staff reflected the palpable tension still hanging in the room. The morning had not gone as anyone expected, especially Judge Harrison. Renowned for his no-nonsense demeanor and strict adherence to courtroom protocol, he had taken pride in running his court with discipline. But today his impulsive reaction had painted him in a much different light, one that even he wasn't sure he could reconcile with. Sarah, for her part, had not let the incident shake her resolve. She stood at the prosecutor's table, her voice firm as she presented the first case of the day, a theft charge involving a repeat offender. She spoke clearly and with authority, laying out the facts in her typical meticulous fashion. It was a skill that had earned her a sterling reputation over her 15 years as a prosecutor, and she wasn't about to let one judge's misstep derail her. Yet, no matter how focused she remained, Sarah couldn't ignore the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Every interaction she had with Judge Harrison carried an unspoken tension. Whenever their eyes met, he would quickly look away, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and regret. The attorneys in the gallery watched closely, some with barely concealed smirks, others with quiet admiration for Sarah's composure under pressure. The court clerk, Mrs. Peterson, moved efficiently at her desk, but even she seemed to glance more often at Judge Harrison than usual. She had been one of the first to try to intervene earlier, waving a note at the judge to alert him to Sarah's identity, but he had ignored her. Now her disapproval was plain, though she kept her expression neutral. The court reporter Linda typed away on her stenotype machine but found herself pausing to take in the unfolding dynamics of the room. She had worked in this courthouse for over a decade and had never witnessed such an awkward display of misjudgment from a judge, especially one as new as Harrison. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder during breaks as attorneys exchanged stories and opinions about what had transpired. By the time a short recess was called, Sarah was gathering her files when she overheard two defense attorneys nearby, their conversation just low enough to avoid outright confrontation but loud enough for her to catch their words. "Can you believe that?" one whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. 15 years as DA, and he treated her like a random defendant? The other replied, leaning closer, "My firm's partners are already talking about filing a formal complaint." The judge didn't even bother to ask who she was, just went straight to contempt. Sarah kept her head down, focusing on organizing her paperwork, but their words cut deep. She had dealt with moments like these before, subtle slights, assumptions about her competence, but rarely so publicly and from someone in such a prominent position. As the attorneys walked away, Judge Harrison's clerk, Mary, approached Sarah cautiously. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she said, "Miss Mitchell, Judge Harrison would like to speak with you in his chambers during the break." Sarah didn't hesitate. Without breaking her stride, she responded, "Please inform the judge that any discussions regarding this morning's incident should go through the proper channels." Her voice was calm but resolute, her words leaving no room for negotiation. Mary nodded, her cheeks flushing, and returned to relay the message to the judge. Nearby, a group of junior attorneys exchanged impressed glances. One of them leaned over to a colleague and muttered, "She handled that like a pro. Didn't even flinch." By lunchtime, the incident had become the talk of the courthouse. Employees who normally gathered in the break room to chat about mundane matters like weekend plans or office gossip were now clustered in small groups, dissecting every detail of the morning's events. "I've known Sarah for 10 years, Linda, the court reporter, said as she sipped her coffee. "She's handled some of our biggest cases." How could he not recognize her? "It's not just about recognition," another employee chimed in. He made assumptions. He didn't even listen to her before jumping to conclusions. That's what everyone's upset about. The courthouse grapevine was alive with speculation and commentary. Some employees speculated that Judge Harrison's actions were a symptom of deeper biases, while others chalked it up to the pressures of his new role and his inexperience with the courthouse's regular personnel. Meanwhile, in Sarah's office, Tommy sat with Officer Joe, working on his math homework. The boy's normally cheerful demeanor was subdued as he glanced out the office's glass windows, where people passed by, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. "Is my mom okay?" Tommy asked quietly, looking up at Joe. Joe smiled reassuringly. "Your mom's one of the strongest people I know, kiddo. She's fine." But even as he spoke, Joe's face betrayed his own unease. News of the incident had traveled fast, and the courthouse staff, Joe included, were still processing what they had seen. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon cases continued, but the earlier tension lingered like an unspoken accusation. Judge Harrison tried to maintain his usual stern demeanor, but it was clear his confidence had been shaken. His gavel felt heavier in his hand, and his voice lacked its usual authority. Sarah, however, remained unshaken. As she questioned witnesses and presented evidence, she exuded the same poise and professionalism that had defined her career. But every glance, every whispered conversation, every subtle nod in her direction reminded her of the larger issue at hand. The assumptions that people made, even in a space that was supposed to be about fairness and justice. By the end of the day, it was clear that this morning's events would leave a lasting mark, not just on Judge Harrison's career but on the courthouse as a whole. The incident had sparked a conversation about prejudice, professionalism, and the importance of looking beyond appearances, a conversation that was long overdue. And as Sarah Mitchell walked out of the courtroom, her son by her side, she knew that while the day had been challenging, it was far from the last time she would stand tall in the face of adversity. Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers during the lunch break, his untouched sandwich sitting on his desk beside a pile of unopened emails. Each ding from his computer brought another notification. Emails from the Chief Judge's office, his colleagues, and even the State Bar Association requesting statements about the events that had transpired earlier that morning. Despite his attempt to focus, the weight of the morning's incident pressed heavily on his chest. His mind replayed the moment over and over. Sarah Mitchell, soaked from the rain, her professionalism starkly contrasted by his dismissive attitude. He had made assumptions. That morning, assumptions rooted in haste and bias, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Elsewhere in the courthouse, Sarah Mitchell's phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages poured in from friends and colleagues, some offering support, others expressing outrage on her behalf. A journalist friend had called twice, no doubt hoping for a comment on what was already becoming a viral story within the legal community. But Sarah ignored the distractions. Her focus remained on her cases. She had 2 more to present after lunch, and she was determined to uphold the standard of excellence she had always brought to her work. During the lunch break, Sarah took a moment to visit her son Tommy, who was waiting in her office with Officer Joe. Tommy's face brightened when she entered, but his smile quickly faded when he saw the tired expression in her eyes. "Mom, are you in trouble?" he asked quietly, his hands fidgeting with the edges of his math homework. Sarah knelt beside him and pulled him into a tight hug. "No, honey," she reassured him. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and then they have to learn from them. That's all that happened today." She kissed the top of his head and smiled, though her heart ached at the thought of him witnessing the challenges she often faced. Tommy nodded, comforted by her words, and Sarah returned to preparing for the afternoon session. She straightened her now dry suit, organized her files, and tried to block out the knowledge that all eyes would be on her when she stepped back into the courtroom. The morning's events had become more than a personal slight. It had sparked a moment of reckoning for everyone in the legal community. By the time the afternoon session began, the courtroom was unusually crowded. Word of the incident had spread quickly, drawing senior attorneys from nearby firms and even law students from the local university. They filled the gallery, eager to witness the unfolding drama. Among them was Chief Judge Barbara Wilson, a towering figure in the legal community with 3 decades of experience. She entered quietly and took a seat in the back row, her presence sending a ripple of whispers through the room. Her reputation for fairness and authority preceded her, and her unannounced appearance added a layer of gravity to an already tense atmosphere. At the prosecutor's table, Sarah focused on her notes, unaware of the chief judge's arrival. She rose to question a witness, her voice steady and clear despite the weight of the morning's events. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison returned to the bench, his usual air of confidence noticeably diminished. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses and glanced toward the back of the courtroom, where Chief Judge Wilson sat watching. As Sarah began, "And where were you on the night of?" she was interrupted by Judge Harrison, his voice faltering as he spoke. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "would you please approach the bench?" The courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable as Sarah set her files down and stepped forward. Following procedure, the defense attorney joined her, but Judge Harrison shook his head. "No need, counselor," he said quietly before addressing the gallery. "Court will be in recess for 15 minutes. What happened next was unprecedented." Judge Harrison, a man known for his stern demeanor and adherence to protocol, stood from his bench and walked around to the front. Standing face to face with Sarah and addressing the entire courtroom, he removed his glasses, revealing tired eyes filled with regret. "Before we continue," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe Miss Mitchell and this court an apology." A hush fell over the room, the only sound the soft tapping of the court reporter's stenotype machine as she recorded every word. "This morning," Judge Harrison continued, "I made assumptions based solely on appearance. I failed to recognize the accomplished district attorney standing before me. Instead, I rushed to judgment, allowing my own biases to cloud my perception." Sarah stood perfectly still, her case files in hand, her expression composed. Behind her, Chief Judge Wilson leaned forward in her seat, her piercing gaze fixed on Harrison. Tommy, who had quietly slipped into the courtroom with Officer Joe, sat wide-eyed in the back, watching his mother with admiration. "Miss Mitchell has served this district for 15 years, Harrison said, his voice steadying as he went on. "She has won countless cases, mentored young attorneys, and earned the respect of her peers. And yet, this morning I failed to see her for who she truly is. I saw only what my own biases allowed me to see." Several people in the gallery pulled out their phones to record the moment, though no one made any attempt to stop them. This was a moment that deserved to be documented, a moment of reckoning and accountability. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice calm and resolute. "Your Honor," she began, "may I address the court?" Judge Harrison nodded, stepping aside to let her speak. "I have been a prosecutor for 15 years, Sarah said, her tone firm but not accusatory. "In that time I've handled cases that have challenged me to my core. I've won difficult trials, lost others that still haunt me, and worked tirelessly to ensure justice is served fairly. But I've also been mistaken for a defendant, a court clerk, and even a janitor more times than I can count." She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. Today wasn't just about a judge not recognizing a district attorney. It was about the assumptions we all carry, the quick judgments we make often unconsciously, and the harm those judgments can cause. In the back, Chief Judge Wilson nodded slightly in approval, her expression thoughtful. Tommy's small hands gripped the edge of the bench where he sat, his admiration for his mother evident in his wide eyes. "The law," Sarah continued, "is meant to be blind. It is supposed to look past race, gender, appearance, and status, focusing only on the facts and the pursuit of justice. But we, as humans, often fail to meet that ideal. Today could be just another story about bias in the justice system, or it could be a moment of change." Judge Harrison, visibly moved, nodded solemnly. The $200 fine form he had hastily filled out earlier still sat on his bench, a glaring reminder of his error. "I accept your apology, Your Honor," Sarah concluded. "But I hope this moment serves as a lesson for all of us, to look beyond first impressions and to strive for the fairness and justice we claim to uphold." Chief Judge Wilson rose from her seat, her authoritative voice filling the room. "I believe we've all witnessed something important today," she said, stepping forward. "Judge Harrison, I'd like to see you in my chambers after court. Miss Mitchell, please join us as well." As the recess was called, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. The tension of the morning had transformed into something different, a shared understanding that they had witnessed not just an apology but a turning point. Tommy ran to his mother, hugging her tightly. "Mom, you were amazing," he whispered. Sarah hugged him back, her heart full. She knew this day would linger in the minds of everyone present, not just as a story of bias but as a moment of growth and change. Sometimes, the most important victories weren't about winning cases but about opening eyes and changing hearts. And as sunlight streamed through the high courtroom windows, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The meeting in Chief Judge Wilson's chambers stretched on for 2 hours. Inside the elegantly furnished office, the air was heavy with the weight of the morning's events. A large oak desk dominated the space, behind which Chief Judge Wilson sat, her hands folded neatly as she listened to the quiet ticking of an antique clock on the wall. Across from her, Sarah Mitchell sat upright in a leather chair, her composure unwavering. Beside her, Judge Harrison appeared far less assured. The confident, authoritative man from the morning was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he looked like someone who had just begun to grasp the full scope of his actions. Outside the chambers, the courthouse buzzed with activity. The morning's incident had spilled beyond the marble walls and into the public sphere. Local news reporters gathered on the courthouse steps, speaking into cameras about what had transpired. Inside the courthouse, staff whispered among themselves, recounting the details they had heard or witnessed. On social media, the story had gained momentum, fueled by a video someone had recorded during the public apology. It was spreading like wildfire, garnering reactions from lawyers, civil rights advocates, and members of the public alike. Chief Judge Wilson broke the silence, turning her computer screen towards Sarah and Judge Harrison. "The video is already online," she said, her voice steady. "It's gone viral in legal circles." Sarah leaned forward slightly to watch the recording of Judge Harrison's apology, now shared thousands of times. The footage captured his trembling voice, the raw emotion in the room, and Sarah's measured response. Chief Judge Wilson clicked through the responses. "The State Bar Association has contacted me," she continued. "So have several civil rights organizations. They're all asking the same question: how will we address this?" Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face pale. "I'll submit my resignation," he said quietly, avoiding eye contact. Sarah looked at him sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. "That's not the answer," she said, surprising both Judge Harrison and Chief Judge Wilson. "Running away won't solve the bigger problem. What happened today isn't just about this courtroom, it's about what happens in courtrooms across the country every day. The only difference is that this time, everyone saw it happen." Chief Judge Wilson studied Sarah thoughtfully, then nodded. "You're right," she said, pulling out a legal pad and pen. "Let's focus on solutions. Here's what I propose. Judge Harrison, you'll undergo additional training on bias in the justice system. Not as punishment, but as an opportunity to lead by example." Sarah nodded in agreement. "I'd like to help develop that training program," she said firmly. "Not just for judges but for all court staff. We need to address these biases openly, not pretend they don't exist." Meanwhile, in the courthouse break room, staff struggled to focus on their usual routines. The day's events were the topic of every conversation. Mrs. Peterson, the veteran court clerk, recounted stories about Sarah's early days as a prosecutor. "I remember her first case," she told a group of younger staff. "She was so prepared she made the defense attorney look like a rookie. But even then, people would mistake her for everything except what she was, a brilliant attorney." The courthouse had become a hive of speculation and reflection, with whispers about what might come next. Outside, security guards had their hands full turning away reporters who tried to enter the building. The local evening news had already picked up the story, leading with the headline: "Federal Judge's Bias Exposed. A Moment of Shame Becomes Opportunity for Change." Cameras panned over the courthouse steps, where journalists speculated about the fallout. Back in her office, Sarah's phone buzzed non-stop with calls and messages. Among them was a text from Tommy. "Mrs. Peterson bought me pizza for lunch. Everyone keeps saying you're a hero, Mom." She smiled at the message, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by warmth. By early evening, Sarah finally returned to her office. She found Tommy curled up on the couch, his math homework still open on his lap. The sight filled her with a deep sense of purpose. Today hadn't just been about her, It had been about building a better future for kids like Tommy. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the National Black Prosecutors Association, inviting her to be the keynote speaker at their upcoming conference. Similar invitations had poured in throughout the day, as the legal community rallied around her. As she gathered her things to leave, there was a knock at the door. Judge Harrison stood there looking weary but humbled. He glanced at Tommy still asleep on the couch and lowered his voice. "Miss Mitchell," he began hesitantly, "I know saying sorry isn't enough. But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better." Sarah regarded him thoughtfully for a moment. Then she spoke with quiet conviction. "Then prove it, Your Honor. Show everyone that today wasn't just about one mistake and one apology. Show them it's about real change." As they left the courthouse that evening, the setting sun cast long shadows across the steps where reporters had finally given up and gone home. Sarah carried Tommy to her car, his small arms wrapped around her neck. She reflected on how a difficult morning had transformed into a pivotal moment in her career. The incident would be dissected in law schools, analyzed in legal journals, and used as a case study in judicial training programs. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was the possibility of real change, the hope that no other attorney would ever be judged by their appearance instead of their abilities. 1 week later, Sarah found herself back in Judge Harrison's courtroom. But this time things were very different. The judge had organized a special session, not for legal cases but for an open discussion about bias in the justice system. The wooden benches were filled with judges, lawyers, court staff, and even law students from the local university. Tommy sat in the front row, proudly wearing a small suit he had insisted on for the occasion. Beside him, Mrs. Peterson smiled warmly, patting his shoulder. Sarah stood at the center of the courtroom, her presence commanding. "Last week," she began, "something happened in this room that many people experience every day. The only difference was that this time, everyone was watching." Judge Harrison sat not on his elevated bench but on a chair at ground level. He had removed his black robe, choosing instead to wear a regular suit, a deliberate gesture to symbolize humility. He listened intently as Sarah spoke. "I've been practicing law for 15 years, she continued. "I've won cases, lost cases, and earned the respect of my colleagues. But I've also been stopped by security, asked to show my bar card when others weren't, and mistaken for everyone except what I am, an attorney." Several black attorneys in the audience nodded in recognition, their faces reflecting their own experiences of being judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. Judge Harrison rose to speak next, his voice markedly different from the commanding tone he had used in the past. "I thought I was a fair judge," he admitted. "I prided myself on being impartial. But last week I learned how far I still have to go. Bias isn't always intentional, but its impact is real. And it's up to all of us to do better." As the session continued, the courtroom became a space for reflection, learning, and ultimately hope. For Sarah, it was a sign that the seeds of change had been planted, and she was determined to see them grow. "I prided myself on following the law exactly," Judge Harrison began, his voice steady but filled with humility as he addressed the room. "But I failed to see my own bias, my own quick judgments based on nothing but appearances." The courtroom fell silent as the weight of his words hung in the air. The people gathered there, lawyers, clerks, students, and community leaders, listened intently, many reflecting on their own experiences. "Miss Mitchell," Harrison continued, glancing at Sarah, who sat composed in the front row, "could have demanded my resignation. It would have been justified. But instead she suggested education. She chose to turn my mistake into a learning opportunity not just for me but for everyone." Sarah observed him closely, noting the transformation in the man who, just a week earlier, had dismissed her in a moment of prejudice. Judge Harrison had spent the past week confronting his own biases, reading extensively about implicit bias, attending workshops, and meeting with minority legal organizations. Now, as he shared his journey with an audience that had grown to respect his newfound openness, his honesty moved many in the room. He spoke of the discomfort of self-reflection, of realizing that the system he once believed to be fair and impartial had blind spots that he had helped perpetuate. "Yesterday," he continued, his voice softening with emotion, "I visited a high school in our city's predominantly black neighborhood. I spoke to the students about careers in law. One young girl raised her hand and asked if she could become a judge. A week ago I might have given her a generic answer, something polite but distant. But now I shared Miss Mitchell's story with her. I told her about the strength it takes to stand up for what's right. And I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in my own courtroom in a long time, hope." From his seat in the front row, Tommy's face lit up with pride. He beamed at his mother, who returned his smile with a subtle nod. Judge Harrison stepped back, allowing Sarah to take the floor. She moved to the center of the room, her posture confident, her voice steady as she spoke. Together, she began, gesturing toward Judge Harrison, "We've created something I believe has the power to make a difference. A comprehensive training program for courthouse staff, from judges to security guards. It's designed to address unconscious bias and promote inclusivity." She paused for a moment, scanning the room. "Real change," she said, her voice filled with conviction, "doesn't come from punishment or shame. It comes from understanding, from education, and from the willingness to be uncomfortable while we learn and grow." The room erupted in quiet murmurs of agreement. Chief Judge Wilson stood next, taking the podium to announce an initiative that would make their courthouse the first in the state to implement mandatory bias training for all employees. "We've already received calls from other courthouses," she said with a small smile. "They want to learn from what we're doing here." During the break, Tommy ran up to his mother, his excitement bubbling over. "Mom," he said, tugging at her hand, "can I tell them about the time you won that big case? The one with the bad guys who stole all that money?" Sarah laughed, ruffling his hair. "Maybe another time, sweetheart," she replied. "Today is about something even more important than winning cases." Later, Judge Harrison approached Sarah, carrying a document in his hand. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his tone respectful, "I'd like you to see this." He handed her the paper, the $200 fine notice he had issued her just a week earlier. But now it was framed with a new inscription. Asterisk, a reminder that justice must see clearly. Asterisk. "We're going to hang this in the courthouse lobby," he explained, along with a new policy statement about equality and respect. Sarah studied the inscription, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and determination. The framed document wasn't just a symbol of past mistakes, it was a testament to the change they were committed to building. As the session resumed, the conversation shifted to solutions. Lawyers shared their own experiences of bias in the legal system, and courthouse staff, from the newest clerks to the most senior judges, actively participated in discussions about how to make their justice system truly just. This wasn't just another mandatory training session. It was a genuine dialogue, one that left everyone in the room with a sense of responsibility and purpose. By the end of the day, the courthouse had received requests from several other districts for copies of their training program. What had started as one judge's mistake was now growing into a movement for systemic change within the legal community. As Sarah and Tommy left the courthouse that evening, Tommy looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. "Mom," he asked, "do you think things will really change?" Sarah paused, considering his question carefully. "Change happens one person at a time, honey," she said. "But today I saw people not just listening but understanding. And that's where real change begins." 3 months after the incident, Judge Harrison's courtroom had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The judge who once made snap judgments based on appearances now took time to greet everyone who entered his courtroom. He made eye contact, offered warm welcomes, and showed genuine interest in each person before him. On one particular morning, he noticed a young woman standing nervously in slightly wrinkled clothes. Instead of making assumptions, he smiled warmly and asked her to introduce herself. She turned out to be a new public defender handling her first case. "Welcome to our court, counselor," he said kindly. "We've all had our first day once." Sarah, watching from the gallery, nodded in approval. She was there to observe the changes she had helped create. The courthouse had become a model for other districts, with people traveling from different states to learn about their bias training program. During the lunch break, Judge Harrison joined Sarah in the courthouse cafeteria. No one found it strange anymore to see them working together. What could have ended his career had instead forged an unexpected partnership. "I have something to show you," he said, pulling out his phone. On the screen was an email from the State Judicial Committee. They had invited him to lead a workshop on addressing bias in the courtroom at the upcoming National Judges Conference. "Are you nervous?" Sarah asked, remembering how far he had come from that rainy morning. "Terrified," he admitted with a laugh. "But you taught me that being uncomfortable is part of growth." Back in Sarah's office, Tommy's crayon drawing now hung proudly on the wall. It depicted his mom standing in court, with the words, "My mom changes things," scrawled beneath in his childlike handwriting. Below it was a newspaper article about their courthouse's new training program, featuring a photo of Sarah and Judge Harrison speaking to a group of law students. The changes extended far beyond Judge Harrison's courtroom. Security guards greeted everyone with equal respect, regardless of their appearance. The clerk's office had replaced its old, intimidating signs with clearer, more welcoming ones in multiple languages. Even the atmosphere seemed different. Mrs. Peterson, the veteran court clerk, remarked one day, "It feels like we can all breathe a little easier now, knowing we're being seen for who we are, not what we look like." That afternoon, Sarah received a call from a black law student who had witnessed the original incident. "Miss Mitchell," the student said, "I almost quit law school that week. I thought, if someone like you could be treated that way, what chance did I have? But watching how you handled it, how you turned it into something positive, changed my mind." Judge Harrison, too, had taken his efforts further. Every Thursday afternoon he opened his chambers to law students from diverse backgrounds, offering mentorship and a space to discuss their challenges. "The hardest part," he told a group one day, "is admitting you were wrong. But the real work is in making sure you don't repeat those mistakes." By the end of the week, the courthouse wasn't just a place of justice. It had become a symbol of transformation. And as Sarah spoke to Tommy's social studies class about justice and fairness, her son sat proudly in the front row, knowing his mom truly changed things. Late that afternoon, Sarah Mitchell was in her office, meticulously preparing for a high-stakes case, when a knock on the door drew her attention. Standing there was a young black woman, her posture confident but her eyes reflecting a hint of nervousness. She introduced herself as a newly hired assistant district attorney. "I applied for this job because of you," she told Sarah, her voice tinged with gratitude and determination. "When I read about what happened, and how you handled it, I knew this was where I wanted to work. You showed me that we can change things from the inside." The sincerity in her words struck Sarah deeply. She smiled, feeling the weight of the moment, recognizing that her actions had become a source of inspiration for others. The changes she had fought for weren't just reshaping her workplace, they were encouraging a new generation of legal professionals to believe in their ability to make a difference. Meanwhile, in Judge Harrison's chambers, another sign of transformation was quietly unfolding. A small handwritten note sat on his bench next to his gavel. It read, "Look twice, Judge once." This daily reminder, simple yet profound, reflected his commitment to seeing people clearly before passing judgment. It was a mantra born of his past mistakes and his dedication to never letting those errors define his future. Each time he reached for his gavel, that note reminded him of the responsibility he carried, not just to uphold the law but to administer justice with fairness and compassion. As the day wound down, Sarah took a walk through the courthouse hallways, her eyes scanning the bustling corridors. The changes were subtle yet profound. People from all walks of life chatted comfortably, their conversations flowing with ease. A Spanish-speaking family was being helped by a clerk who spoke their language, a scene once marked by frustration now unfolding with efficiency and warmth. Down the hall, a young black attorney strode confidently into a courtroom, greeted with the same respect as his peers. Sarah couldn't help but smile, her thoughts reflecting on how far they had come. Real change, she thought, watching these small but significant moments unfold, happens in the little things day by day. At the end of the day, Sarah picked up her son Tommy from the courthouse daycare, a new addition that had been suggested during the reform discussions months earlier. As they walked to the car, Tommy looked up at her with curiosity in his eyes. "Mom," he asked, "are you happy with how things have changed?" Sarah paused, glancing back at the courthouse. The memories of that rainy morning came flooding back, her rushed steps, her wet shoes, and the frustration of being judged unfairly. Yet, standing here now, she saw how that single moment had become the spark for something much greater. "Change," she said, smiling at her son, "is like growing up. It happens so slowly you barely notice it until one day you look back and realize how far you've come." A year had passed since that fateful morning when Judge Harrison had mistaken Sarah for someone other than the accomplished district attorney she was. The courthouse stood tall in the morning sun, its exterior unchanged, but inside, it was a very different place. As Sarah entered, she was greeted by Officer Joe at the security checkpoint. "Big day, Miss Mitchell," he said with a grin, nodding toward the growing crowd in the main hall. Today was the first annual Diversity and Justice Conference, hosted right here in their courthouse. Tommy, now 13, walked proudly beside his mother, adjusting the suit he had chosen himself for the occasion. "Mom," he asked eagerly, "can I sit in the front row? I want to see Judge Harrison's speech." Sarah chuckled at his enthusiasm, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, guiding him toward the transformed courtroom. Inside, the main courtroom had been reconfigured into a conference hall. Judges, lawyers, and courthouse staff from across the country filled the wooden benches, their conversations buzzing with anticipation. At the podium, Chief Judge Wilson stood, preparing to open the event. Her voice resonated through the room as she began. 1 year ago, she said, an incident in this very room sparked a change that none of us expected. Today we gather to share what we've learned and how far we've come. From her seat, Sarah spotted familiar faces in the audience. Mrs. Peterson, the veteran clerk who had retired last month, had returned for this special occasion. Beside her sat the young public defender who had once been nervous on her first day. Now she exuded confidence, a skilled attorney with several victories under her belt. When Judge Harrison took the podium next, the room fell silent. Gone was the stern, quick-to-judge man of a year ago. In his place stood someone transformed, speaking with humility and wisdom earned through months of reflection and change. I stand before you not as someone who has solved the problem of bias, he began, his voice steady, but as someone who has learned to recognize it in himself. My greatest mistake became my most important lesson. The audience listened intently as he spoke about the changes in their courthouse over the past year. Signs in multiple languages now welcomed visitors, reflecting the diversity of their community. A new mentoring program paired experienced attorneys with students from underrepresented backgrounds, offering guidance and encouragement to those who needed it most. Even the security staff now mirrored the city's demographics, fostering a sense of belonging and fairness. As Sarah listened, her phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo from a courthouse in Texas, proudly showcasing their newly implemented bias training program, modeled after the one she and Judge Harrison had created. These messages had become a regular occurrence, each one a testament to how their story continued to inspire change across the country. During the lunch break, Tommy took it upon himself to give visitors a tour of the courthouse. Leading a small group to the lobby, he pointed to the framed $200 fine notice that still hung prominently on the wall. This is where it all started, he explained, his tone mature beyond his years. My mom turned something bad into something good. From a distance, Sarah watched her son with pride. She remembered how scared she had been that morning a year ago, rushing into court with wet shoes and messy hair, her confidence shaken. Now, that moment had become a symbol of transformation, a turning point not just for her but for everyone who walked through these halls. Judge Harrison approached her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Your son's quite the tour guide, he said with a chuckle, handing her one of the cups. He told my group that his mom and I used to be enemies but now we're partners in justice. They both laughed, marveling at how far they had come. The afternoon sessions included panel discussions where court staff at all levels shared their experiences. A young black bailiff spoke about feeling more confident in his role, knowing he was valued not just for his position but as an individual. A Hispanic clerk described how the new language training program had allowed her to serve her community more effectively. Each story painted a picture of progress, of a courthouse that had chosen to grow rather than remain stagnant. Near the end of the day, Sarah took the podium for the closing speech. The room fell silent as she began. A year ago, she said, her voice steady, I was just trying to get through a rainy morning with a flooded parking lot and a school emergency. Her eyes found Tommy in the front row, his face beaming with pride. I didn't know that morning would change so many lives, including my own. She paused, scanning the room. But the real story isn't about that one morning. It's about what happened afterward. It's about a judge who chose to learn rather than defend. It's about a courthouse that chose to grow rather than ignore. And it's about all of us deciding that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. As the conference concluded, people lingered in the hallways, exchanging stories and contact information. The courthouse, once merely a place where justice was served, had become a symbol of how justice could be better. Packing up her materials, Sarah looked over at Tommy. He was thoughtful, his young mind clearly processing everything he had seen and heard. Mom, he said, his voice soft but certain, remember when you told me change happens one person at a time? I think you've changed a lot of people. Sarah hugged her son, her heart full as she looked around. The courthouse stood as it always had, but inside, everything was different. And somewhere, in another courthouse, someone might be having their own rainy morning moment. But now, thanks to their efforts, they had a blueprint for turning it into something beautiful.